Among many accomplishments, my guest today is one of the most influential voices in strategy and innovation. A long-time professor at Columbia Business School and founder of Valise, her advisory consulting and capability building firm, she has transformed the way we think about competitive advantage, disruption, and organizational agility. Her work is a wake-up call, I believe, to any leader who is working with outdated models of permanence in an impermanent world, actually, a very uncertain world. She's the author of The End of Competitive Advantage, Discovery-Driven Growth, and Seeing Around Corners, many books that have become obviously essential guides for leaders navigating turbulent changes. A regular Harvard Business Review contributor as well, and trusted advisor to many global organizations. She's also a sharp observer of the human side of strategy, how organizations thrive, how leaders learn, and why ignoring work signals is the surest way, to fall behind and be behind. So it's really a pleasure to welcome you to Positive Leadership Podcast, Rita McGrath. A warm welcome again.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Jean-Philippe.
So let's start with where I start usually, as we often do. I love to start at the beginning where I'd love you to talk a little bit about your childhood. I understand it's been also in a background of science with two researcher parents at Yale. So I'm interested about the dinner conversation that might have happened at that table on science and the way that actually opened your mind, not to go to science, but to think about organization, strategy, business development, and more. So tell us more about a moment maybe of that dinner table. What was the conversation about?
Sure. So my parents, as you pointed out, are both scientists. My dad was one of the leading figures in organic chemistry, selenium and tellurium chemistry specifically, and my mother was a microbiologist. And they immigrated to the States from Germany and to take roles at, as you said, at the Yale Medical School. And they were on the research side, not so much on the teaching side. And, our family dinner conversations would often go into some kind of argument, and the answer to any argument was always to be found in a reference book. And so they had a home library where if you were disputing anything from, the length of the diameter of the Earth to the likelihood of global warming, you went and found the relevant reference. So they were kind of googly people long before there was such a thing as a Google. And in fact, my dad later on said he thought that search engines had actually put him out of what he was planning to do in his retirement, which was basically construct searches for other people. And the algorithm kind of took over. But it was that kind of family. Very, very curious, very interested in what was going on in the world. And I think the connection to what I did later was that sense of just why do things in organizations work the way that they do, and what do the decisions that decision makers make actually mean. So I started out wanting to do political, policy, more than management. But shifted that direction when I did my PhD studies.
If I understand well, you started in terms of studies at Barnard College. Interesting enough, actually, one of my daughters studied in Barnard College as well. She loved it.
It's a great
a few years after you, obviously, but it was a wonderful experience for her.
It's an amazing developmental experience for young women. It absolutely is. And sort of Barnard women tend to outperform.
Would you call it something specific to that moment you had at Barnard College that is still on your mind, Rita?
I think the thing that I hadn't expected when I went there, and I didn't go because it was a women's college, so that was not my primary driver. I wanted to be part of Columbia University, and I wanted to be in New York. But what I hadn't appreciated when I joined was that these subtle examples of, all the heads of all the clubs were female, all the leadership that you saw were female, not all the faculty, but a lot of the faculty at the top of their fields were women. And so, it's hard to be what you can't see. And at Barnard, you had those examples to follow. The other thing that I think was very powerful, which again, I hadn't quite appreciated till afterwards, was just how much less stress, you feel as a person in a minority situation
Yeah.
than you do when you're actually in the majority. And I think for formative periods of your life, it's actually really helpful, which is why sometimes think we need to really rethink, when do we glom people together and when do we let them be, just
Yeah.
within a subgroup of their own, which we often don't really think about very much. We're not intentional about it.
Agree. And at a time where DE&I in the US has been quite challenged in many different ways, that's an interesting topic, I guess, or
It is.
challenging topic to discuss these days, isn't
Well,
it?
there's a couple of things that we know from research that I think are
Yeah.
relevant. One is that people that are in the minority group, and this could be men if they're in a group full
Yeah.
of men, it could be black people if you're in a group full of white people, it could be white people if you're in a group full of black people, but any group that's in the minority has what we call a lower band of acceptable behavior. So at the high end, if you're gregarious and pleasant, you're dismissed as a lightweight, but if you're aggressive and demanding, you're called names or worse. And so what that does is it constrains your causes of action. We also know from research that if you're, for example, being pitched to join a board, that if you have only one of something, so it's a black person or a woman or a Hispanic or somebody who's not the minority, that if there's only one, that the decision makers perceive that as a much riskier decision than if they have multiple candidates to choose from who are of that persuasion. So there's some very interesting human dynamics with respect to how diversity plays out in corporate decision making.
Yeah. So continuing on this education background, Rita, you also went to Columbia and eventually did a PhD, I think, at Wharton. So when you got to university into your early research years, what nudged you again from the bench to the boardroom towards strategy and innovation? Was there a class, a mentor, a moment, a project that really flipped the switch in you and show you that organizations could be run more like living experiments, as you call them?
Yeah, I think there was. So my first job out of my master's degree was working for the city of New York. And at the time, we were computerizing the procurement system there. That's what we called it back then. Today, we would call it digital, or maybe it would be AI or something now. But anyway, we called it computerization. And that was a fundamental change to how that organization operated. And so I was too young to know that I didn't know what I was doing. And my career took off very quickly. And I ended up being in essentially a managerial capacity. I was managing about 12 people on my own and about another 12 or 24 consultants. So it was quite a lot to sort of manage. And I saw firsthand how interesting it was just to notice where changes were accepted and took hold and how they were embedded and where they weren't. And so when I decided to leave the government and go back and get my PhD, I joined the Wharton School, and my mentor was Ian McMillan, with whom I've co-authored several books and written a lot of articles. And I told him I was very excited about studying the science of implementation. And he looked at me, and he was running the Entrepreneurship Center at the Wharton School. And he looked at me and he said he couldn't think of anything more boring than writing about the science of implementation. Well, lucky for both of us, into that field came a guy named Ira Rimmerman, who was a senior vice president at Citibank at the time. And he really wanted to explore why some ventures, inside ventures at Citibank, flourished and why they didn't. And so he came to us with the idea of funding a 3-year study in which we would interview people involved in both the successful ones as well as the unsuccessful ones, create case studies, and then see if we could extract some lessons from that. And so I'd have to say that project was the one, and I was the project manager for that project. And if I had to pick one project that really sort of said, wow, all this stuff I've been wondering about organizations, it all comes together in this sort of venturing, uncertain space. And, at the time, strategy was seen as something very different from innovation. If you have to go back a few years, but people studying strategy were studying things like order of entry and industry structure and, that kind of thing. And I was interested in the decisions individual people made and the individual projects and how they went. Well, of course, today, those two fields have really come together in a big way where we can't really talk about strategy without talking about innovation and vice versa.
Yes. Interesting, actually, that you mentioned that Macmillan, right, was going into entrepreneurship. Was there a time where you asked yourself the question about entrepreneurship versus corporate strategy?
Well, they have some similarities. They also have some
Yeah.
very important differences. Corporations have riches of resources. The
Mhm.
people will whine about being budget constrained, but honestly, a big corporation usually has a lot of resources to throw at
Sure.
anything. But at the same time, big corporations also have a lot of legacy. It's what I call the mothership problem, right?
Yeah.
So little ventures have far fewer resources, but as a result, they have to be much more innovative. They have to be much more imaginative, but they're also more vulnerable. If a little venture runs out of money, it goes out of business. If a big company is going down the wrong track, it can sometimes pursue that for years before anybody sort of says, "Why are we still doing this?" Now, in an economy, what we know is that today, a lot of innovation, for example, in the American economy,
Yeah.
similar to, I think, to other places, is now being done by the smaller companies who then get bought up
Right.
by the big ones. So it's kind of a question mark, which is, how effectively are the large
Mm.
organizations internally innovating? So, the notion of a R&D center,
Yes.
where everything is discovered, I think we're seeing a lot of sea change there. Now, this could all change with regulation. If
Yeah.
back in the day, if, for example, Facebook had tried to buy Instagram, they would have been stopped by a regulator as, eliminating
Yeah.
competition. And that hasn't been a concern for a while. So
Yeah.
the regulatory environment does have an impact on where innovation happens.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting later on in this dialogue, Rita, to discuss about the implication of some of the work you've done with your research on again the strategic inflection points, the strategic thinking process as well, and the way it can converge or not eventually between some large companies that have to transform themselves and some of those much more agile startups that we see happening, particularly in the tech sector. So I'll come back to that later on to get your point of view on what is it possible or not to actually combine in terms of the cultures between those two kinds of companies. Now, I'd like to go back again to some of your early start. Your family's moved to Webster when
Uh-huh.
your father had joined Xerox, of course, and later Kodak, I think,
Mm-hmm.
put you near two American icons navigating massive technological shifts. And I read that your father actually worked at Kodak, if I'm not mistaken, and witnessed, obviously, its decline at some
Mm-hmm.
point.
We did.
That experience seems to echo so much of your work
Mm-hmm.
on strategic inflection points. So, looking back, was it the fact that you are watching Kodak closing plants that seed you for your work on strategic inflection points and transit advantage? And what early cues maybe did you learn through this major shift happening,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe through again some other dinner conversation with your dad?
Oh, sure. So I'll never forget, one day my dad came back from an airplane flight all the way across the country. And he
Mhm.
had been at a thing called Xerox PARC, which is the
Oh
Palo
yes,
Alto Research Center, which was the home of so much of the modern,
tech
digital
innovation. Yeah,
context that we know. So he'd actually been there. He had read a set of documents called the Pendery Papers, which were very, very early in anticipating what the digital revolution was likely to be. And he just was infused in it. He came home with stories about a thing called a mouse, and I was like, "What do you mean,
yeah.
a mouse?" And I mean, we all thought he was talking
And the
science.
GUI, right? The graphic user
Graphical
interface,
user
well, the
interface,
GUI.
mouse, all this stuff. And he'd been there,
Yeah,
he'd seen it. I should
yeah.
also mention my dad was a very avid science fiction reader.
Mm,
So he really enjoyed stories about the possibilities in the future. And being a scientist, you'll often find for your listeners, the people in
yeah,
your organization that sort of see the future the best are the scientists. They're the ones at the
yeah.
edge. They can see, where discovery is
Right.
going, and yet they're often not consulted. And this was the case with my dad. So Xerox decided, out of a whole calamity of occasions that I've
Yeah,
discovered about later, that they were going to get out of the chemistry business and they were going to go more digital. And this is
yeah,
one of the things that Park really saved them on, because the guy that invented what eventually became the laser printer, which
yeah.
eventually saved Xerox after they
Yes.
lost control of their patents for plain paper copying. That guy came out of Park, and that's the story. It's funny, nobody tells that story. That saved the
Yeah.
company. But anyway, right around then,
Interesting.
the need for ink,
Mm.
the need for the chemistry that went into ink was
Yeah.
starting to shift, and my dad picked up on that. And he realized that he could go to Kodak But here was the interesting thing. There was kind of a gentleman's agreement between the two companies that they would
Really?
not go and poach each other's people. So
Huh.
he was advised, my dad was, that if he wanted to work at Kodak, he would have to be the one to make the move. And he was, a little concerned about that. But anyway,
Of
they snapped
course.
him up. He's a brilliant guy. And so first day on the job, he's sitting down with a guy named Thomas Whiteley, who later in life actually studied dinosaurs, which I've always thought was the universe is being ironic. Anyway, so Whiteley says to him, "So Wolfgang, what do you think about the future?" And my dad, who'd been to the future, he visited there,
Yeah.
he said, "Oh, well, it's pretty clear. 8 millimeter film has had it. The world is going digital. Laid it all out, right?" And
Yeah.
Whiteley kind of looks at him and says, "Why don't you go back to the research labs where you can do minimal damage?" Um, I mean, just that moment was just so. And my dad was telling me about it. Now, by then, I think I
Huh.
had already left for college,
Yeah.
but you could see that inside the company, a lot of the
Hmm.
people who were my dad's colleagues would go to, the suits at headquarters, and they would say things like, "Look at what this thing can do," and they'd look at him and go, "Well, who else has invented this? Nobody. Don't you understand? This could be a whole new category," and they just
Yeah.
couldn't process it, right?
Good. Yeah. And the rest was history. But we'll come back to that, obviously, and the lessons you learned from that. So before entering academia, I think you held also several roles in technology, public administration, and even entrepreneurship, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So those early career experiences give you a perspective that many strategy scholars don't necessarily have, actually. The view from within complex, evolving systems and organizations.
Mm-hmm.
You've worked in IT, as we said, in politics, and you co founded startups before becoming a professor.
Mm-hmm.
Looking back, all those different roles and early roles shaped your strategic thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think strategists benefit from having been exposed to lots of different patterns, and I think
Yeah.
you'll know this in your own work, which is if you've only ever been in one environment and been accustomed to one set of boundary conditions, and something occurs which is outside those boundary conditions, you kind of don't know what to make of it. But I think having been exposed to all these different environments really allows you to pick up on a pattern and see it when others might not. So in the political sphere, in business we like to think, oh,
Hmm.
politics, that's awful and terrible. But if you think about it, politics is what you have to do to get people to do something that they would not do absent your influence. And so, you have to get comfortable with politics. And what better place to get comfortable with politics than city government? It was fascinating to see how those decisions got made. What people actually decided to do. And the City Ventures project that I mentioned earlier was such a great opportunity to just probe into
Hmm.
multiple case studies of places in the financial world where people tried things, some of which worked, some of which didn't.
Yeah.
What made
Yeah.
the difference?
Yeah. So when you think about everything you learned at the time, and did you have any desire to come back to politics, if not politics, into the public service area? I mean, at the time where obviously government efficiency has been quite discussed, not just in the US, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
all across the world, including my home country in France.
Mm-hmm.
What would be the way for you to head that government efficiency department if you were leading the department, Rita? What would you do,
what I
strategically thinking?
Um, well, I think the first thing you need to think about in running part of the government is, government is necessary when there isn't a market, right? When markets fail, or when there's some benefit to the citizenry that doesn't prove profitable, right? So.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you go all the way back to Adam Smith, he was very clear. Governments have to provide for defense. He argued that governments should provide for the education of the population. He didn't mention healthcare, but that wouldn't have been much of a conversation in the 1770s. But if you think about things like that, the government is there to produce. Government's there to provide its citizenry in many cases against risk. So if you think about Doge and what a lot of the people that were
Yeah.
fired are, what their jobs are,
Yeah.
it's doing things that don't have markets. It's protecting us against risks. It's looking at things that are systemically oriented, like public health. And
Hmm.
if you don't understand what you're taking apart before you start to take it apart, then you're going to have all kinds of unanticipated consequences. So if
Yeah.
you um, For example, in 2017, on the front page of the Wall Street Journal was an article called "The Next Pandemic is Something Like the Next Pandemic is Near," and 2017. Now, in the article, they wrote very
Yeah.
seriously about the pandemic was going to come. It would travel around the world because of airplane travel much faster than any point in history. It would probably be animal to human transmission of some kind, and bats would be a high probability. Literally front page article in the Wall Street Journal. And we took it seriously for a while, and then we didn't, and then we basically dismantled the infrastructure that had begun to be put into place to help systems deal with the effects of the pandemic, to the point where when it finally happened, we weren't very well prepared. And that leads you to a lot of what we saw at that time, which was huge disagreements among people with legitimately different points of view about what should happen. And I think had we been prepared, we would have had those arguments, first of all, out of the public eye, and secondly, with more time, with more sanity, with more ability to take a deep breath and say, well, what's the best outcome we could achieve here? Instead, we had to, make a lot of decisions very quickly in the throes of a crisis, which is never what you want to do.
Yeah, it seems to me that in many governments across the world, including in Europe, obviously, there's less and less of any kind of strategic plan. There's less and less investment in what could be called resiliency of the economy, the society, which talks to your point. And I think there's many of those investments that were done or kind of done in some places that have been cut and not existing anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think a very interesting situation is what's playing out right now in green technologies. So if I just take three players, if I just take the U.S., Europe writ large, and China. China has gone headlong into making green technologies which will work and whatever. And I think the U.S. is positioning itself to give up its leadership position in that. And I think that's probably going to be revealed down the road as a mistake. And we don't have 8 planets to burn. So it's not a question of whether, it's a question of when we'll make a transition, and what's the science we're investing in now? What are the discoveries we need to make now to be able to live comfortable lives without a dependency on fossil fuel? I'm not trying to say something. This should not be particularly controversial. But when you look at how that gets played out in the policy arena, it's a very interesting thing. And I think Europe often gets criticized for they're so backward, they're not tech, but that's not the case in green technologies.
I agree. Anyway, there's a bigger debate happening because even right now in Europe, there's more and more discussion about cutting down on environmental protection as well across the countries. Let's continue the dialogue we had, Rita. Again, listening to you reminds me actually of a conversation I had with another guest. Her name is Duram Shanaz. She's the founder of Impact Investment Exchange. And like you, in a way, she has navigated across very different worlds, in her case, from Wall Street finance to microfinance in rural Bangladesh, and then leading a global impact investment platform with a lot of success. And what struck me was her cross-sector journey gave her a unique ability to connect the dots between disciplines that rarely speak to each other, right? You're talking before about science and business not talking to each other. I wonder if this is also something you've experienced in your own career. Would you say that one of your superpowers is being able to connect the dots across disciplines and industries?
I would say yes, and blush a little as I say it. But as a strategist, right? What you need to be able to do is see possibilities and patterns. So I think something we're starting to realize now is that strategy is as much about imagination and pattern recognition as it is about analysis and sort of crunching the data, which didn't used to be how people thought about strategy. They used to think of it as a very sort of analytical undertaking. But what I think as a strategist is, the idea that you can see a pattern emerging in one place and having it repeat or connect somewhere else. So I'll give you an example. There's been a great deal of distress right now about pedestrian deaths from cars striking them at night has been on the rise. And there's been a lot of discussion about why could that be? Well, there could be many explanations, but nobody seems to have settled on something that's for sure. But here's a hypothesis I would have. Now, whether I'm right or not, I have no idea, but it would be the seeds of something you could study further on, which is, this number started to go up at the time that cars began to have these very sort of blinding headlights.
Yep.
And the reason investigators might miss this is that the driver that got blinded would not be the one with the headlights. It would be somebody who inadvertently missed something and couldn't see.
Yep.
But you'd need to design a careful study to see whether those two things were related, and I haven't seen anybody mention that. So that's an example of, you sort of see a pattern in one place and then wonder,
Yes.
how does that connect to another thing?
Yeah, no, just continue the discussion about seeing patterns, connecting the dots, seeing around the corners. What advice would you give to early career professionals? Because there are many listeners who are early in their career as well, who are unsure whether their non-linear path will add up to something someday.
Well, first of all, I give them some encouragement because I believe yes is the answer. What I'm seeing increasingly in corporations, and this is actually backed up by some research that was done by LinkedIn and Korn Ferry. And the advantage of using the LinkedIn database is you can actually map people's careers. So what they did was they took a whole group of people I believe it was a consulting firm, and mapped who was actually most likely to get to the C-suite. And what they found was almost all of them had very diverse, zigzag kind of careers. So I think the first thing is don't be afraid of that. If it's a horizontal assignment, then maybe you came from operations and now you're going to learn finance. That's probably a really good thing. I would look for those kinds of opportunities. I would look for companies which are comfortable with having people move around the organization.
Right.
My own research has shown that those kinds of companies tend to be more resilient than companies where people are trapped in horizontal silos and everything's a step up or down a ladder. I would also be very supportive of continuing your education. Now, whether that's directly career related or whether that's something different, but I think the people that really set themselves apart are the ones that are continuously developing new skills, new hypotheses, new ways of thinking. And what we're starting to see now is our educational systems are starting to respond to that. So there's a at a really young level, there's Mackenzie Phillips, I think her name is, has started the Alpha School, which is a 2-hour learning situation. So what the kids do is they come to school because you want to be in a physical place, and there's a lot of socialization and things that happen when you're all together that's still absolutely essential to human growth and development. But they do all their academics in 2 hours using AI tutors and real human guides. They don't call them teachers, they call them guides. And then the rest of the day they spend working on life skills, which is overcoming challenges, making inventions, exploring things from a very young age on. And their students they come out, right, knowing how to have impact in the world with very substantial ways of being sort of self-aware and self-driven. And I think we're starting to see that way of learning filter out into the larger university setting. So at the higher ed level, there's a fascinating project in San Francisco called the Minerva Project, which is similar, but for college-age students, trying to really train them to overcome challenges, define problems, and have a social impact as well.
Yeah, I love it because I'm also pretty passionate about higher ed. We met in a forum, we discussed some of that as well, being the chairman of Schema, which is a business school globally as well. And we are having active discussion with, researchers, professors, and executives on how can we actually blend those experiences and those disciplines together in a way that is very different from traditional curriculum. I think higher ed need a major reset, but we'll come back to that topic because I know you are pretty adamant, I'm sure, to discuss that. And funny enough, my last comment, Rita, just a couple of days ago, I was listening to the podcast where actually the leader of Alpha School was invited to discuss with Reid Hoffman. So I listened carefully. It was very interesting to hear exactly what you said and think about the way it could be applied to different classes of ages as well. And in many ways, to me, that also combine not just the power of AI, obviously, personalized education, but also the way you can really blend some unique experiences personalized by students. And in many ways, that resembles to entrepreneurship as well, in my mind.
Yeah, so at the executive education level, what I do in a course, it's a week-long course. It's called Leading Strategic Growth and Change.
Yep.
And this is for people, so you've got your pre-K, they've got the 2-hour learning, then you've got your higher ed, they've got Minerva. I'm now at the more senior end of the spectrum, but we come together for a week. So we have that in-person dimension, but the participants each bring a personal challenge with them. And I make time within the context of that week so that they can actually work with their peers every day on that challenge. And what I find is just getting them out of the work environment, having them physically together with other people, letting them really get input from diverse people from all over the world. By the end of the week, they've almost always either reframed their challenge, had a new light on it, thought of it. And this I felt really proud about. One participant who'd taken my course in the past actually turned up as an attendee. And I said, didn't you already take this course? He said, yeah, but I've got a really bad problem I want to work on. And this is the most
to solve.
I thought that's a new thing. I'd never had that
Yeah.
experience before.
No, that's wonderful. To me, this is really the promise of collective intelligence, right? And bring a group of people together, where you create obviously the enablement of the social connections and a shared context, so that the trust is there, so that they can share their challenges and build solutions together. And this is something actually I'm doing with my NGO on entrepreneurship. So I'm a strong believer in that collective or community effect, growing people one by one and collectively together. This is very powerful.
But I mention one more thing for young people, and this has to do with building networks. And what I think a lot of people don't realize is that there's two kinds of networks you need. So one is this kind of network we're talking about, where you can finish each other's sentences and you trust and you're in this like close, intimate environment. And I think that's very important. So that's obviously key. But you also need another kind of network. And this is an entrepreneurial network of loose ties, where it might be somebody you met at an awards ceremony, or it might be somebody who went to a conference, where you don't have that closeness.
Yes.
What the entrepreneurial network gives you is access to information that's not shared by
right.
So that's where you get access to opportunities, access to new ideas, that diversity we were talking about a minute ago. So you need to put time into both. And I think I would say it's for young women. What I see happening a lot is they'll just be heads down, getting the work done. This is great.
Yeah.
And they don't take the time to invest in building those broader networks.
Create those networks. No, I absolutely agree. So let's continue again. By the time you joined Columbia Business School in the early 1990s, you're already obviously on your way to becoming one of the most respected voices in the field. And over the years, research has evolved into an impressive portfolio of books: The Entrepreneurial Mindset, Discovery-Driven Growth, The End of Competitive Advantage, Seeing Around Corners, as well as countless other business review articles that have shaped how leaders think about innovation and change. In The End of Competitive Advantage, you argued that sustained advantage is dead, and that in fast markets, advantages are transient and must be renewed repeatedly. So do you see transient advantage as a way for incumbents as well to essentially disrupt themselves before someone else does it?
Well, they have to almost. If you look at the track record, most large companies who seem so invincible today last about 40 to 50 years before they go out of business, merge, or get taken over. And so the track record of companies being able to disrupt themselves is sort of not great. I think it's possible, and I think the more enlightened leaders of today recognize that. But here's the thing: when somebody comes along and says, here's this new technology or whatever, right? And it's going to radically change the way that we, I'll take a current example. Kraft Heinz just announced it's breaking up, right? And after putting itself together, and then they tried for 10 years and it would struggle one way or another. So now they've decided they're breaking up again. But here's the thing: that company became dominant in an era where, prepared foods, canned foods, heavily processed foods, at a low price, or at a cost, a price that the average household could afford. And they learned to run things very well in that world. Well, now the world is shifting, right? At the low end, you've still got the demand for, inexpensive processed food, but that demand is being met by brands like Kirkland, which is Costco's brand. Kirkland alone sells more than all of Kraft Heinz combined. And then at the the high end, right? What have you got? You've got frou $9 fruit smoothies and, vegan chicken
Yeah.
wings and, all that. So you're kind of seeing the middle getting hollowed out. And so if that company is going to respond to that kind of challenge, a lot of what they knew has to be unlearned. A lot of what you do, a lot of what got you where you are, if you're a
Yeah.
decision maker, has to be left behind. And that's one of the reasons why I think the challenge is so big. Because if you think about corporate careers, by the time I go through the trouble of transforming and import the new capabilities and do all this stuff, am I still going to be there to reap the reward? Is what a lot of senior executives ask. And so if I can just eke out 1 or 2 more years, kind of doing what I'm doing, maybe that's the easier path.
Yes. That's a great example. Any other example you have in mind of companies, incumbents that you've been supporting, coaching on disrupting themselves?
Oh, sure. So I think I can tell. Yeah, I can talk about this publicly. So if you look at the giant truck leasing and management maintenance company Penske, which is a
Yep.
privately held company, so they've got a very long time frame, and they said about 10 years ago started exploring what role technology and more specifically technologies like AI might mean, and they recently rolled out a product called Catalyst AI. And the cool thing about Catalyst AI is you put this, AI-enabled sensors on your trucks, and now instead of having to look at historical data when you're planning out your fleet, for example, or making capital investments, instead of just having like a one-time view in time of what's going on, you can
Yep.
actually see how your fleet's comparing, like with a digital twin, and you can
Yep.
make decisions in real time about things like how do I reduce idling cost, or can I think about preventive maintenance so the truck doesn't break down in the first place, or whatever. And the users of it can now really do a much more digitally informed view of their trucks. And because Penske's kind of a neutral player, they're not affiliated with any of the particular manufacturers or whatever. They just run it across.
Yep.
So that would be the kind of innovation that it's not going to change their business overnight, but in the long run, it'll be absolutely fundamental. And I think the company realizes that.
And in that particular example, what do you think they had to unlearn, as you said it before?
Well, I would imagine there were a lot of people in procurement and a lot
Uh-huh.
of people in, fleet planning,
Yeah.
that would feel themselves to be, the way that they used to do it is going to change
Yeah.
radically.
Radically. Yeah.
It's what I call an inflection point, right? So it's 10x faster, it's 10x cheaper, it's 10x whatever. So you can anticipate a certain amount of resistance on the part, within the client companies. But in this particular case, the economics are so compelling that it's very hard to make the argument that we should be doing it the old way.
Yeah. So talking about another company, I recently had on a podcast the chairman and former CEO of Schneider Electric, Jean-Pascal Tricoire, who is a good friend of mine. I got to know Jean-Pascal for many years. And, in the conversation we had, he talked about the danger of living in a bubble for a CEO at the top of large organization. He said that leaders must stay obviously close to the ground to avoid being caught off guard. And it feels very aligned with your message, I think, and your philosophy as well, I think, Rita, right?
Yes.
How can leaders, by the way, which is hard, avoid the complacency of success and keep an organization hungry and curious for what's next around the corner?
Well, I think leaders have several levers at their disposal. So, the first lever that they've got is their own agenda. What are you spending your time on? Who's getting meetings with you? Are you getting out into the field? So, in my most recent book, I have some questions you can ask yourself, right? Which is, am I getting myself directly exposed to my company's interactions with its environment, right?
Yep.
So, and do I do this personally? Because if you don't do it personally, nobody
Yeah.
else in the organization is going to see it's important. So, I think that's a hugely important lever. I think making the time for it, right? Because these don't feel like productive uses of your time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet it's the conversation with the guy on the shop floor who says, wow, we never had that supplier in here before. Or,
Yeah.
listening on a customer service call where a customer is saying this thing that you thought did X actually does Y and I hate it. Or even I love it. I mean, companies miss opportunities all the time because nobody
Yes.
in the company is actually paying attention. So I think how you use your personal time is one. And then you can build structures to do this. So I have one CEO who I know who every quarter he has this computer system randomly pick, I think it's 21 people across his company from all over the world. flies them to headquarters, and they have sort of a 2 to 3 hour breakfast. And all he does
Together.
in that breakfast is he just goes around the table, feeds
Hmm?
everybody, right, which is
Yeah,
nice.
yeah.
And he just says, tell me about something happening in your region that you think I should know. And it's
What's in
as
your
open
mind?
as that. It
Yes.
could be politics, it could be
Yeah,
something about
yeah.
the company. But, think about it. Like after that meeting, he's got a much richer idea of what's
Yeah.
going on sort of out where his company actually participates.
No, I love it. I think it's very practical. It's something I kind of used to do a lot as well, which is
I
I think
think
you get to be very intentional in your time management to
Well,
do
you do,
certain
and
things.
part of the risk that you face as you get more and more senior, and this is, I
Cool.
think, an interesting message for your more junior people too,
Yes.
is people, without meaning anything bad necessarily, are always going to try to shade the truth a little bit, hide the bad
Yes.
news, and that's
Yes.
so dangerous. That's so dangerous because what starts out as a little problem, very seldom improves on its own.
Yeah. No, I agree. So you've long championed discovery-driven planning, a kind of strategic humility in action. It's a playbook for innovating under uncertainty, where you treat plans as assumptions,
Mhm.
run low-cost tests to convert assumptions to knowledge, then scale a few bets that validate
Mhm.
again the theory you have. What makes it so hard for organizations, Rita, to adopt this approach? Even when they know that traditional fork, as an example, doesn't work anymore.
Exactly. Oh, such a great question, and it is a puzzlement. I mean, that article came out 30 years
Yeah.
ago, the initial article. Well, I think there's a couple of things. The first thing is that when you think of the value you create as a leader, there's two kinds of value. So the first kind of value is the things that we can put in a forecast and plan, and conventional metrics work just great when uncertainty is relatively low. So if next year is going to be a lot like this year, and this year was a lot like the year before, and you've got that kind of predictable rhythm
Hmm.
to your business, you can do a lot of things that we've learned to do over time to keep our businesses healthy. As uncertainty increases, the value that you're creating is the value of future options. And as
Yes.
human beings, we do this all the time. We know if you're a farmer and you don't preserve your seed corn, you know you're not going to have anything to plant next year. If you're an R&D person and if you don't keep investing in innovation, you know you're not going to have a future. As a parent, if you don't send your child to college, you know there are certain opportunities that are going to be not accessible to them. So as human beings, we make these option-oriented decisions all the time. And yet when it comes to planning in business, all of a sudden we snap back to the other side of that equation and we expect people to answer impossible things like, what's the
Yes.
ROI of this, robotic, analyzed toothbrush going to be? I mean, I don't know. You don't know. Nobody knows. What comes after Zoom? I don't know.
Yes.
And so I think the first thing that holds people back is that assumption that we have to know the right answer before we even start. So that's one. I think another thing that holds people back is a lot of our corporate processes
Mm.
kind of create the wrong behavior. So what do I mean by that? So I study corporate flops. That's one of my signature things. And these are the big ones, right? Where a company you have to lose your parent company at least $50 million to get into my flops file, which is over there in my
Okay.
home office. And when I look at the leadership of a lot of these failed ventures, you see this very common pattern. These untested assumptions, which get taken
Mm.
as facts, very few opportunities to test and learn.
Yeah.
Very often, leaders put under tremendous pressure by their parent companies to do something
Mm.
fast and do something big.
Yeah.
Big teams and lots of budget up front. And when you're doing that in a very uncertain environment, it's a recipe for disaster. So
Mm.
instead, what I argue is keep the team small, right?
Mm.
At first, figure out what you need
Yeah.
to learn, figure out your path to learning, and then people say, "Well, that's uncontrolled. It's chaos." No, it's actually not. It's more predictable. It's more you can know more precisely what's going on than if you're hidden behind some
Yes.
PowerPoint deck or a spreadsheet. And so I think we just bring to it the wrong reflexes.
Yeah. To me, it sounds very much like the learn and
Mhm.
test approach of startups, right? Where you've got to try, test it, and move on. If it doesn't work, to the next one. But at least let's give it a try without making huge financial bets, huge investments,
Exactly.
and big plannings as well ahead of time.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the way the venture capitalists have, but
Yes.
they'll invest in 10 things. 8 of them they know from the get-go are not going to turn into anything big, but the last 2 really
Yeah.
might. And at the starting point, you don't know which. And as the
Yeah.
VCs will tell you, if I knew which ones were going to be the winners when I started, I wouldn't invest in all 10. I just invest in the one that would work. But it's not how it works.
So as we discuss again those methodology, Rita, I'd love to ask you a couple of questions about what it takes from a people, from a culture, from a leadership standpoint to make it happen. Because people can read all those books, but they cannot necessarily take action.
Mhm.
So isn't discovery-driven planning only possible in a growth mindset culture? One that really shifts leaders from knowing the answer to owning the learning. Uh, and in many ways, is I think what it took for us at Microsoft when I was working there for many years, alongside Satya Nadella,
Mhm.
to transform the company back in 2016 to the last 10 years. It was all about evolving this growth mindset and being curious, extremely curious about the possibles and what was beyond the corner. So tell me more about that environment, that culture that is needed to take such an approach.
Yeah, well, I think what Nadella did was just a marvelous case study of how you change a culture. And indeed, the growth mindset part is a big part of it. I think a lot of other factors come in. So, what do you reward people on? I mean, one thing
Yes.
that was in place at Microsoft
Incentives. Yep. Yeah.
was, this ranked stacked thing, and that produces all kinds of terrible behavior. So if you've got 5 high performers and 2 low performers, you'll hang on to the low performers so that you have somebody to fire when the
Yeah.
evaluation comes. I mean, that's just like antithetical to being able to operate this way. So
Yep.
I think you need to think about incentives. I think you need to think about that growth mindset, that cultural openness, that hunger to say, hey, there must be something more out there. The other thing that goes with it, though, is being willing to let go of the past. I mean, I think
Mm.
getting rid of the handset business and taking a $7 billion
Yep.
layoff, I mean, that was a pretty gutsy move. But making the decision that we're never, that ship has sailed, right? We're never going to be on top of
Yep.
that, and what we're going to put our bets is cloud and mobile and other things. So I think it's being willing to get rid of the past, being willing to sort of take some bets on the future, and then being willing to try
Mm.
things and fail. So a great example of a company that really does this well is Corning. And
Mm.
what you'll hear from Corning people is that the CEO really wants them experimenting, and if the experiment doesn't work out, they're not
Yep.
punished for that. They're put on the next promising project.
Mm.
The other thing they do that's very interesting there is everybody's reward system is connected to the fate of the whole company.
Mm.
So another thing you'll see that gets in the way of innovation is if I'm being rewarded for how well my division does,
Yes.
I have no incentive to support your division. So, for example, at Sony,
Mm.
they could have built a huge division if they connected their movie business to their game business, but instead the people in the movie business were incented to, increase their own returns. So they ended
Yes.
up
Right.
licensing out all this incredibly scarce, content to all these other game companies, rather than Sony
Yep.
benefiting
Yep.
from having the two but connected, right?
So, in your own experience, Rita, how can leaders role model again this discovery planning and mindset?
Mhm.
And can you show an example maybe of a leader you've worked with
Oh,
who
sure.
did this successfully?
Absolutely. So I think the first thing leaders need to be prepared to do is be content to lead by checkpoints, right?
Mm.
Rather than having some giant goal. I mean, you need to know what success looks like. That's important.
Yep.
But proceeding through checkpoints along the way to getting there is really vital. And I think we try to push people too much to say, well, in 18 months, where will you be? And instead ask in 18 months, where could you be? And then backcast, right? What would have to be
Yep.
true for us to make that? So that's a mindset shift, I think. So an
Yes.
example of this, I'll give you one from Citibank, and then we can look at one from MasterCard.
Mm.
So at Citibank, they were speculating that big companies would be interested in sort of offloading their payments functions. So if I'm
Yep.
a cereal company or something, why do I want to be in what's essentially a financial services
Mm.
business? And so they had this hypothesis that they would set up this little outsourcing unit who would just take over payments from their customers. And so we said, well, let's identify if payments is in fact a pain point for customers, and let's identify what they'd be willing to pay to outsource it and everything. And so we went out and really began looking at what was
Mm-hmm.
going on. And what we learned was, and I say we because I was studying them as part of my
Yep.
dissertation research, and what we learned was that the people doing payments were also doing other stuff, which the
Mm.
companies weren't willing to let go of.
Yeah.
And so therefore, even if they wanted to outsource the payment piece, they wouldn't give away the trade secrets and other
The
things that these
rest.
people were working on. But
Yeah.
there was a string of payments that they were more than happy to outsource, and that's what came to be called nuisance payments. So,
Mm.
I have to write a matching check for my employee's charitable contribution, or I've got to pay a one-time fee to fix a roof somewhere, or that kind of thing that wasn't in the midst of this big massive payment flow. They were more than happy to get rid of that, and that ended up being this nichier. I mean, it was a smaller footprint, but very profitable business for Citibank, because it just interrupted the flow of things in these big companies, and Citi was able to do it very well. Another one that ended up with a decision not to pursue the business was one that we looked at with MasterCard. And with MasterCard, what they realized was that they had actual purchase data, on things. So you could conceivably connect the fact that somebody bought something to something that happened earlier. So to an advertisement or to a salesperson's outreach or to something. And they explored going into a business where they could do that. And what they learned as they were out in the marketplace is that was seen by their main clients as overreach. That that their data was being used to kind of monetize something they didn't want to do, and so they ended up actually deciding not to move forward with that plan. And it was interesting because other kinds of companies, Google or Facebook come to mind, monetize data streams all the time. But in this particular case, MasterCard learned this was going to interfere with trust, and therefore they wouldn't move forward with it.
Thank you for sharing some very concrete example. I think that really brings to life some of the concepts sometimes you read and you don't necessarily capture easily. On the same podcast, Amy Edmondson, that you may know, I'm sure, reminded us that psychological safety is not about being nice, which I fully agree with. It's about being able to experiment and speak up as well. And this connects, I think, with your vision of failure as data as well, with the data that you just talked about. So what role do you think psychological safety plays in fostering strategic innovation?
Oh, it's huge. It's huge because, the things that cause strategies to fail, are often the things nobody's willing to talk about. So in the MasterCard case, right? What would cause us not to move forward with this? And I wouldn't even call it a failure, right? I would say what would cause us to say, whoa, there's reasons not to move forward. It's because something we didn't anticipate came into view. We were willing to be honest about it. We were willing to say, no, that's a value that we're not going to transgress against. So I think the ability to say something different is I think super important, to have that diversity of perspectives in the room. What I often find is people will develop kind of a groupthink, and the more senior you are, the more people will tell you that you're brilliant and that your every move is great and that there's no disagreement with whatever you're doing. And so it can create this enormous blind spot. And psychological safety, if you can promote it, is something that I think is just critical. So I'll give another example. David Coady was CEO at Honeywell. He had a practice when he would go all around the corporate empire, and when he would have decision-making meetings, he told everybody, look, I don't need to have the right answer going into the meeting. What I want to get is the right answer coming out of the meeting. And he had another practice that I thought was really fun, is he would call on the most junior person at the table to speak first. And he said, look, you see things from a different perspective than us older guys who are running the place. I want to hear from you first. And of course, at first, the junior people are like nervously looking at their bosses, and they're like, well, am I saying the right thing? But over time, people kind of got used to it. And it really did help engender this idea of here's a safe space where we can bring all the bits of knowledge that we have together.
No, I agree with you. I think this is good practice, but that needs actually an enabling culture that opens the door to this humility, this confidence, to accept any voice at the executive level and not just prioritize and make judgments based on the pure seniority of the people.
Right. Well, and if you think about some of the big disasters in corporate history, it's because they didn't have psychological safety. So Volkswagen and the emissions scandal, Enron and cooking the books, and the list goes on. I mean, these large corporations where there was not a culture of candor, where whistleblowers get punished. I mean, a lot of bad stuff can happen when information's not shared freely.
Yes. So I like really to talk about another famous HBR article you wrote. You wrote so many articles, great articles, Transient Advantage, that treats strategy like an operating system, actually, which is quite interesting for me. You advise companies to think and compete in terms of arenas, not industries, to trade some efficiency for speed, measure and fund renewal as a core capability. So if you were to redesign a company today, what are the 2 or 3 mechanisms you would wire
Ah,
to accelerate again those cycles,
ah,
and which efficiencies would you deliberately give up?
mhm. Yeah, so I'm actually writing about this. This is my new book project.
Okay.
It's called the permissionless. It's about the permissionless organization, and the construct there is to create teams, small teams that have all the functional capabilities that they need or ready access to them. And then
Yeah.
think very carefully about how they are connected together. So if you think about the mass market economy, which is what we're kind of moving out of and moving into the digitally enabled economy, in mass production systems, right, what you want, and you're very familiar with this, is, you want functional specialization, which was when bureaucracy was first introduced, it was an advancement, right? Before that, we just had taskmasters, bosses telling people what to do. Well, so what bureaucracy did was it allowed professionals to develop professional skills in functional silos, and the output was millions of the same thing. So millions of canned beans, millions of autos, millions or thousands at least, but lots and lots of the same thing.
Yeah.
What tomorrow's organizations are going to need to do, and I think this is Kraft Heinz, right? What tomorrow's organizations are going to need to be able to do is produce very personalized, very customized things that maybe, economic units of one. So your mass market structures are not going to be really fit for purpose. Now, there are a few places where you'll need them, especially if you have a lot of information. So if you're manufacturing a pharmaceutical, for example, and your information is very codified, but it's not widely diffused yet, that's where a hierarchy kind of makes sense. But if what you're doing is sort of figuring out unique experiences that are tailor-made, so if you look at Airbnb as an example, every single encounter between a host and a guest is to some extent personally curated. And you need a different kind of structure to run that. And so if you talk to the CEO of Airbnb, Brian Chesky, what he'll tell you is that he's kind of developing this idea of shared consciousness with his people. So he has like 40 people in his orbit that he's with all the time. So they don't have to have like rules of engagement. They don't have to have rule books at all because they're together so much. They kind of know how each other think. And so in a given situation, they'll be able to make a decision that's consistent with where the company thinks it's going.
Yeah, that's good. So another great example. So in seeing around the corners, you recast strategy as an early warning system, scan the periphery, name weak signals, and then really test fast, actually. Can you walk us through an example again where a leader or company successfully saw around the corners, and what made them able to do that, to act before again the tipping point happened?
Well, I think a canonical example is when Adobe saw the advent of cloud-based software, basically coming for their business. So if we go all the way back to before 2008, what Adobe did was made very pricey, very good software in shrink wrap boxes that they sold in CDs to, to individuals, to companies basically who could afford to pay a lot for them. And two things happened. The 2008 crash sort of interrupted their cycle of upgrades. Every 2 years you'd get a new thing and you'd pay for it, and then and a lot of customers just said, whoa, we can just hang on to what we got for now. So that was a big wake-up call. But then, right around then, and you'll remember this, was, we started to see the reality of cloud-based services starting to be popular. The strength, the security, the ability to sort of separate out different instances of these things became real. And the leadership at Adobe kind of said, we need to be prepared for this, because if we're not, some upstart is going to jump into this space, because, once you have access to the cloud, you don't have to buy servers anymore. You don't have to buy a program, and you can use off-the-shelf software, and. So they went on a very deliberate quest to re-platform the center of gravity of their business, and they, I was talking to their CFO, around that time, and he said, "Oh yeah, and I spent 40 days and 40 nights on the road explaining to the analysts how they had to look at Adobe differently, because the metrics for a SaaS-based system are so different than the metrics for a shrink-wrap box sales system." And he was very successful. But they went about it very deliberately, like they were very conscious that was an important constituency to explain things to. And here's the interesting thing. As he had predicted, their revenue, as they were in the midst of this transition, their revenue went down, their market cap went up. Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah, well, obviously, it rings a bell with me, as you can imagine, Rita Microsoft, because we had to go through exactly the same,
Yeah.
the same, reset as a company and move from the pure licensing operating model we had as a company. We are selling a bunch of software by license
Right.
to customers to the cloud economic model, which is consumption, as we
Mhm.
call it. As you know, consumption
Usage.
is
Yeah.
the is
Usage.
usage by the customers, which is wonderful because it just tells you the truth that your product is being used and is useful, and your customers care, and then you can improve and you can make it better, and so on. So, yeah, it's been a wonderful vector for pretty big transformation of that industry, and still
Mhm.
more to do now with AI, by the way. But we'll come back to AI in a few minutes.
Okay.
So, uh, in this podcast, uh, we often talk about purpose and mission-led leadership. I'm thinking here of what Sal Khan, which had a podcast, who told me in our conversation that resilience and purpose go hand in hand.
Mhm.
When you are grounded in your mission, uncertainty becomes more manageable.
Mhm.
But you could also argue that if purpose can focus attention, it can also blind it, I think.
Mhm.
So, do you see purpose as a kind of strategic anchor during times of disruption? And what is your acid test, as I called it, that helps a values driven team
Mhm.
to stay open to disconfirming signals without abandoning its mission?
Right.
So,
Well,
how
so
can you do that?
sure. So if we think about human motivation, and Dan Pink talks about this, he says there's three things that motivate people at work. So the first is agency, the sense that you have some control over your environment. You're not being micromanaged, that you can exert influence over what you do. The second is mastery. So, am I growing? Am I learning? Am I developing? And then the third is purpose. Do I have something that gets me out of bed in the morning that I'm excited by, that is
Yeah.
stimulating to me? And I think we've had a lot of conversation about purpose lately, and I think the definition of purpose has kind of slipped over to the fuzzy ESG goals,
Hmm.
got to save the planet kind of thing. And I don't think it has to be that. The
No.
purpose of a company could be achieving engineering excellence, and I'm excited to
Yes.
go work on this. It could be,
Yes.
it could be indeed, it could be serving our customers best as possible. And for example, Jeff Bezos, since the day one of Amazon, has talked about becoming the world's most customer centric company, whatever that means. And so I think, in that sense, purpose provides kind of the glue that
Hmm.
holds it together. Now, you becoming the world's most customer centric company, just as an example. There's lots of ways to do that. And so I
Yeah.
think one of the things that companies who do this well, do this strategically well, do is they say, well, if this track doesn't work, let's stop
Hmm.
that, and let's try a different track. And I think Amazon's a great example of a company that's been pretty unafraid to both move its resources around
Yeah.
and shut stuff down. They're not very sentimental about businesses that don't go anywhere.
So, how would you advise a CEO or leadership team these days to think about their purpose?
What is it that galvanizes us? What is it that
Mhm.
makes us excited about coming to work here every day? And as I said, it
Yeah.
could be technical. I mean, at Corning, for
Yeah.
example, it's, we want to be 10 years ahead of our customers. I mean, that's a pretty amazing thing to think about, right? But what that means is, if that's what you want, right, then certain things, right? You know that you're going to put money into long-term investments. You're not going to punish failure.
Yeah.
You know that the people who really are important are the ones who are going to be the scientists, the technical specialists, and the people making those people's jobs easier, and right. So
Yeah.
if that's your defining purpose, there's a lot of things that flow from that, if you really mean it. Now, if you
Yes.
don't mean it and you say, "Oh, we want to be 10 years ahead of our customer," but you babble on about what happened this quarter, there's a disconnect there. And
Of
I see a
course.
lot of companies where the espoused purpose is not what the CEO actually believes in.
Hmm.
So if you join WL Gore as an example,
Yeah.
it's a company that doesn't really have managerial hierarchies. It's very peer based. How you get
Hmm.
evaluated, how you get compensated is a function of how much value your peers believe that you're contributing, and you're all together to kind of discover the next great thing. And that's a company with something like 12,000 people in it. I mean, it's big.
Hmm. No, another good example. So I think what stands out in your work in the discussion we are just having now, Rita, is often you remind us that strategy is not just about numbers. It's also about people, ambitions, and culture.
Mhm.
So, how do you help leaders in your capacity to connect the dots between organizational strategy, capabilities, and human behavior, people?
Oh, that's so important. It's so important. And one of my great examples of this is Sharon Price John, who is the CEO of Build-A-Bear Workshop, which in
Hmm.
percentage terms has outperformed even NVIDIA. If you looked at them from an
Wow,
investor point of view, yeah, it's an amazing story.
stunning. Yeah.
So she has a method that she calls the Spark method. And she says, well, you have to start with the end in mind, right? You have to then prepare, where are the right skills? What are the right things? You have to be prepared to action it. You have to, what's the K for? And you have to be prepared to, I forget what the R is for. And then the K is you have to keep the faith. You have to keep renewing. Oh, you have to renew, and then you have to keep faith going all the time.
Yes.
So I think the mistake a lot of leaders make, I think, when they're trying to connect strategy and humans, is they assume people understand what they're talking about. Firstly, the strategy can become this just jumble of words. It's not really
Yes.
pointing people towards a future that is really meaningful. And so repeating yourself a lot, making
Yeah.
it clear what you're not going to do as well as what you are going to do. So what's off the
Hmm.
table, is as
Yep.
important as what's on the table. And then I
Yep.
think, a last thing that I think leaders underestimate is, let's say it's a change in strategy that you're
Yep.
working on. Well, any kind of change is going to be subject to emotional responses. And we know how human beings respond to change, whether the news is good or bad. There's often shock, right? Then there's denial.
Yep.
Then there's some sadness in there, because even if it's a good change, we have to leave
Yep.
something behind. There's often anger. And then finally, if you get to bargaining and justification and reconstruction, you're getting people with you. But I think a lot of leaders misread that adjustment process as resistance when it isn't. It's emotional coping. And so
Yes.
creating the space in which people can kind of process, in which people can come to grips with it, is
Yep.
absolutely necessary. And then I think it's also really important to recognize that not all people are going to be equally effective in all situations. So,
For sure.
as a friend of mine once said, sometimes to change the people, you have to change the people.
Yes. Yes, indeed. So, in your own experience, what are the most common human blind spots that undermine good strategy?
Oh, I think hubris,
Hmm.
nostalgia, uh, political infighting rather than focusing on the external environment.
Yes.
And you certainly would have seen a fair amount of that at Microsoft. A lot of organizational stuff that gets in the way of creating the most value for the customer. So, a really good friend of mine talks about the return on politics in an organization.
Yeah.
And what I think you want is to minimize the return on politics as much as you possibly can, and maximize the return on value creation as much as you possibly can. So that's a sort of a short version. And a lot of this is things you can deal with at a systems level. What I observe in organizations is people have not taken the time to dismantle the old stuff before they try to
Yeah.
propose the new stuff. So we
Yeah.
add and we add and we add and we add, and eventually you end up with a system that just stops working.
It's messy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a friend of mine, Michael Lurie, who's now at Bayer as their chief catalyst, is his title now. He came over there from McKinsey, and they're going through this massive change. They're trying to take this famously historical bureaucracy and really boil it down to small teams with a system that he calls directly shared ownership, where
Okay.
people are, as I described earlier, people have access to, or they have all the functions that they
Yeah.
need in their teams, where they can move things faster, where they can make decisions closer to the edges of the organization. Now, it's still a work in progress, but you can see them really making that effort.
Yes. No, I think those are good reminders for all of us. And this reminds me actually of a discussion I had as well with another guest, Melody Upson, who talked about confident humility. Her view was that strong leadership doesn't mean, obviously, having all the answers. It means staying open, curious, and willing to be challenged. And you've been speaking about the danger of overconfidence, actually, in strategic planning. So, how do we build leaders who are both confident, adaptable, and vulnerable?
Yeah, so I think, and I think this is something that drives me crazy, which is because, when people talk about leadership, they talk about, on the one hand, you have to be vulnerable and open, and then, open to admit and be wrong. And on the other hand, you have to be, demanding and challenging people and pushing
Tough and
people.
yeah.
It's like, well, what is it, right? So a really great example of somebody who I think got this balance very, very much right, it would have been Alan Mulally during his time at Ford.
Yes.
And he had systemic ways of making sure that the truth was coming out. And so, what he did was he made it really clear he what responsibilities each member of his team had, and he called this the business plan review process. And it was a weekly meeting, and everybody was required to bring their metrics to the meeting. And when Alan walked into Ford, they were on track to lose close to $17 billion. And his system color coded all the activities that the company was supposed to run, and it was red, yellow, and green. So if it was green, it was on track. If it was yellow, some warning, but I kind of know what to do. If it was red, this isn't going well, and I don't know what to do.
No.
Right? And so Alan walks into one of his first management meetings. So you have to picture this, because here's a car guy, a bunch of car guys, and here's an airplane executive walking in, right? And so there's a lot of kind of, who is this guy and what's he trying to do? And he walked in, and it was all green. Right?
All green.
And he
Yes.
said to them, hey, we're on track to lose $17 billion. It's not our.
It's all green.
Yeah, and so finally, one of his leaders who'd been working on one of their most important new launches got up and said, "Okay, I think I have one of those red things you keep going on about, and I'm red on Edge, which was the launch of this sort of in between models that they've been counting on for their turnaround. So they had dealers lined up, they had ad spend lined up, all this stuff, and this guy who subsequently became the CEO." Said, he did the right thing. He stopped the production line because it was a flaw in the manufacturing of the car, which would have interfered with its quality. So he did the right thing. But now they've got this problem, right? And Alan stands up, claps his hands, says, "That's great visibility. Let's stop the meeting for a minute, go around the table, and who's got ideas?" And within 10 minutes, they had the foundation for what was going to become a way of tackling that challenge. So somebody had an idea about what to do with advertising. Somebody said, here's how we could handle the dealers. One guy said, hey, I've got an engineer I can loan you for a month who I think might have some answers. I mean, 80% of the thing was solved within 10 minutes. Now, it takes a remarkable leader to impose that kind of discipline. So I was asking Alan, I said, so after that happened, what happened? He said, oh my God, it was awful. It was like a rainbow in there. But he has an interesting mindset. He said, think of your reds as a gift.
Yeah, absolutely.
If things really had been green, then he said, I don't know what to do to turn the company around.
Just as a funny additional anecdote, because of course we tend to use a lot of scorecards, at least in the past at Microsoft for many years, and with the reds, the yellows, and the greens across the world. There are many of that, and at some point we call some of the color codes watermelon, because people were kind of in between. You could say, well, you've got a yellow maybe, but the way or the narrative, because you've got the numbers which are factual, you've got the color code, which sometimes, if it's qualitative versus purely quantitative, you've got to kind of, to have a judgment. And watermelon was like a way to excuse yourself.
That's funny. That's funny.
Anyway, so now I'd like to talk a bit about technology and AI. We are clearly at an AI inflection point, and it's something that is fascinating for me, for listeners, I think for all of us. And some forecasts, as discussed in a recent article from The Economist over the summer I was reading, imagine a 20-30% annual growth. The leadership test, as you've argued, is whether we convert that surplus into human flourishing and investing in infrastructure of learning, care, and capability, and not just more data centers, right? So let me ask you a big economic and societal question, Rita. If paid hours shrink dramatically, okay, with this AI, scenario at, on the steroids, which categories of work remain human, and how should people and policymakers reallocate time, income, and learning?
It's a great question. So here's where I come down on that. I think we're rewiring the social contract that was basically arranged from the beginning of the mass production era. So think of that as like the invention of mass production by Henry
Yeah.
Ford, right through the post-World War II consensus. And that consensus was all around, if we can build cheap homes, and let's not forget, it was a government decision that allowed that to happen. It was the creation of the 30-year mortgage. Before you had that,
Yes.
the mass of people could not afford,
Yes.
inexpensive homes. So we're going to take cheap land and cheap money. We're going to use the government to design a system that's going to deliver to us a solid middle class. Then we're going to give that middle class access to automobiles. We're going to give them access to appliances. And that was a world that was designed. It was shaped.
Mm.
I believe we are at another moment where we need to make those decisions. And what I hope, right, is that the commitment to the way Carlota Perez, who's a Venezuelan economist, puts it, she said, capitalism only retains its legitimacy if the narrow motivations of the few provide benefits to the many. And I think we're at one of those absolutely pivotal moments right now. And you can see it in our politics, in complaints
Yes.
about income, these transitions in capitalism. That pattern's happened before. So what does the future look like? As I said before, I think we're going to have value creation in teams and small groups that are going to connect themselves in ecosystems. So I think the very concept of management is going to kind of need to be rethought. Now, somebody's still going to have to make these choices and design things and allocate resources. I mean, it's not that that's going away, but I think it's going to be handled very differently. Can it lead us to human flourishing? I absolutely believe it has the potential to do that if we make those kinds of choices now.
Yeah. Well, many big decisions to be taken in the coming year. So let's zoom now into one profession that you know really well, consulting. You've argued AI turns the classic pyramid into a diamond. Junior analysis, automated, scarcity shifting to relationships and trust. And the open question becomes how to train entry-level talent when the apprentice actually tier things out, actually is being taken out. So paint us the operating model of a consulting post-pyramid, again, firm. How do you price when analysis is near zero marginal cost? And what does Valley's style capability transfer engagement look like for our listeners? Valise, if my pronunciation is okay, maybe I'm wrong. Let you pronounce, is your own consulting firm, right?
Yes,
Rita.
So I think it really has to do with so for the junior people, right? I think what we need to develop are skills training, call it like digital twins, where they can come into a situation, they can be presented with, the activity, they can do kind of what the skill building requires. So there's a great book on this called The Skill Code by a guy named Matt Bean. And what he talks about is people will create, the people that will get ahead will create opportunities for themselves to grow in their skills and knowledge. And this is where it connects to this kind of make sure you have jobs that cut horizontally across various application efforts. So for consulting, if you think about consulting, traditionally there have been three kinds, right? So there's been procedures consulting. You call up Accenture, you want to put in a payroll, you say I want 15,000 consultants here by Wednesday, and they do it. They're magical, right? Then you have the traditional gray hair consulting, and the value there was always the wisdom, the craft, the McKinsey. I've been through this before, and that's where I think the pyramid is going to be really challenging, because what you don't have is the ability to bill for the younger people to pay for the older people.
Right.
And what you have is brains consulting, which is I've got this wicked one of a kind problem. What I don't need junior people on it. What I need is the best minds on the planet to come help me figure this out. So I think more of that consulting type work is probably going to be in the brains space. And I think what we might be looking at is a shift in the way we think about value. And this is not just consultants, this is law firms, this is accountancies, this is everything. Because right now we have a very industrial time-based concept for what value is. So I bill you for so many hours. even the concept of overtime. What is overtime, right? If we move to a value-based construct, right, where the fact that I get this answer for you saves you $100 million, right, and we can have that kind of conversation. I think the very business model changes radically.
Yeah, so let's come back now on the education discussion we started a little while ago at the beginning of this discussion, Rita. Should individuals, people still invest in education? You've pointed to AI clearing admin routine analysis with educators so that actually educators can mentor, coach, and inspire. So if you were to redesign, I don't know, Harvard exec education programs from scratch, what would you do? What would you automate?
Executive education or more junior?
No, executive education, and then we can maybe talk about both of them. Would be great. Yes, exec and junior. Yeah.
Well, executive education, what you're building there is know-how that people wouldn't get, on the job necessarily, but they need to be able to carry it back to their work.
Yep.
So what we know about that part, the being able to retain and use what they learned, is we know the best way to do that is to have people working on specific projects. And I do that with my course. We've seen other courses where people might work across a company on a given project, but it's the application and the use of the skill, not just seeing it or hearing about it, that makes the difference. So I think exec ed is most likely moving much more towards actual engagement with whatever the thing is you're trying to master. So, and I think that applies at more junior levels too. So if the thing I need to know is how to write a persuasive presentation, maybe you use an AI tutor to help you with that, and you get feedback and you work on it until you get together with a group of humans and then see how well. So I think this idea of connecting application to learning is going to be much more prevalent in our system. And if you think about it, a lot of our education system was designed to take people off of farms and impose industrial discipline on them. So that they showed up on time, they sat in rows, there was a teacher teaching at the front of the room, everybody moved at the same pace. Perfectly sensible for an industrial system, makes no sense for a digital system of learning.
So now in 2025, what would you say to a young leader who feels that they have to know everything to be taken seriously?
Oh, I don't think that's been ever true. I think if you can develop curiosity, if you have the ability to ask really good questions, that's a skill to definitely hone.
Yes.
And the willingness to learn, I think you'll be taken seriously. Why not?
Okay, that's only a good platform to build, always has been, and I think will be. Agree with you. No, I'd like to finish with a couple of last questions, Rita. And obviously coming back to positive leadership. A positive leader is purpose-led and evidence-based in their optimism. They grow people and learning speed, design for trust, and hold themselves accountable for financial, social, and environmental results as well, altogether. Same accountability. Through your lenses, transient advantage, arenas over industries, discovery-driven planning, and seeing around corners, what are the 3 design choices a positive leader should make, you think, to turn AI-driven efficiency into a durable value creation?
Oh, lovely question. So I think the first thing that is super important is what's your governance structure? So what is the mechanism through which people and resources are directed and redirected over time? And a lot of organizations haven't even got one. I'll say, tell me about your innovation governance platform. And they'll say, what are you talking about? So I think the first thing you have to be proactive about is how are we going to make those decisions? And different companies make them in different ways, right? So some companies are very consensus-based. Some companies are more, senior leader-led. But let's be deliberate about what our process is. So I think that's the first thing. Second thing is back to this idea of the agenda. What does the senior team spend their time on? How does that now roll out into what other people are spending their time on? And I think the third thing is conscious decisions about what needs to be tightly coupled in your organization and what can be more loosely coupled. So they're in a stable situation where, again, you've got a lot of predictability and things are going to look the same next year as they do this year. You can afford tighter coupling. But in a changing situation, tighter coupling just slows you down. So what that feels like is I've got to go get permission from 15 people before I can make a change to my website. right? Whereas if the website team is loosely coupled, right, they can make that decision kind of on their own without having to check with marketing and check with finance and check with accounting and check with compliance. And I think that most companies don't make those decisions consciously. And in fact, when I go into firms and they say, who's responsible for your organization design, I very often get a blank look. It kind of emerged, right?
Yes.
And a lot of companies are not very conscious about how the organization design flows into what else the company can do.
Yes. So unfortunately, this is going to be my very last question, Rita. Time has passed very fast. If you could really pick just one piece of advice for the leaders listening to this podcast in this time of high uncertainty, volatility, anxiety, I mean, add your own adjectives and words, what would be that one piece of advice, Rita?
I come back to, what is the good that you're trying to accomplish? What is that end in mind that motivates you and keeps you up at night? And then how well do you connect that to how you spend your time every day?
So start really with if not the end game, start with a clear vision of the impact you want to have in the world.
Yeah.
That sounds very much like positive leadership. That's a great conclusion.
Well, there you go.
Well, thank you so much, Rita, for this wide-ranging discussion. Very inspiring as well.
Thank you.
You've been navigating across the sea of strategy, of organization, of leadership, of AI, and more. And to our listeners, if you enjoy this episode, please share it with your friends. Feel free to put 5 stars. That would be very appreciated, of course. And join us again in 2 weeks for the next episode. Thank you so much. Stay tuned. And again, Rita, thank you so much for this great dialogue.
Thank you.